with that, I want to turn our attention to Pat Smith. And as you know, if you follow these monthly virtual Lyme impact sessions, you know we get really the highest caliber speakers. We get quality individuals that are speaking to the Lyme community from their area of expertise. And when I introduce them, I'm usually taken aback by the breadth of their experience, their bio, their curriculum vitae, and knowing that when I got from Patricia Smith, her bio, her background, I have to say right up front, I was humbled. I am going to take a moment, allow me to introduce properly some of the background accomplishments of Pat Smith. So for the last 25 years, she's been president of the all-volunteer national nonprofit Lyme Disease Association. She's a member of the Columbia University's Lyme and Tick-Borne Disease Research Center. She's on the advisory committee. She's also a member of the Food and Drug Administration's partnership to promote avoidance and tick exposure. She serves on the panel for LymeX, which is the private-public partnership of the Cohen Foundation and the U.S. government, Health and Human Services. She's a two-term Health and Human Services Tick-Borne Disease Working Group member in Washington, where she co-authored not only the 2018, but the 2020 Tick-Borne Disease Working Group report to Congress, where she wrote several minority reports within those documents. She was appointed in 2016 to the member of the U.S. Army Medical Research Tick-Borne Disease Research Program and the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program Programmatic Panel. Twice testified in front of Washington, D.C. on the Lyme Council. She's been involved with the New Jersey Lyme Disease Advisory Council through Chairman Smith, Senator Smith. She is on the Environmental Protection Agency 2011 Lyme Prevention Conference. She was a co-chair with the CDC. Member, former officer of ILADS, our infectious disease society that's really sponsoring and supporting the Lyme constituents that are important to us. She's a member of the online journal Contagion Infectious Disease Today. She's a chronic Lyme expert panelist. During her presidency with the LDA, she has led the effort to raise funds for researchers nationally. They have awarded 123 research grants, and they have research acknowledged 58 scientific journal reports on Lyme disease and the nature of the illness. When you look at the scope and the breadth and the involvement of what Patricia Smith has brought to the Lyme community, it really is mind-boggling. And still today, we have to fight for every inch that we get to be recognized as a disease when it comes to recognition, when it comes to treatment, when it comes to insurance reimbursement, when it comes to really acknowledgement that this is something that really is now the largest infectious disease-borne illness in America. So with that, I'm truly humbled to introduce Pat with all your accomplishments. Thank you. We're very appreciative. And with that, allow me to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I mostly appreciate the fact that you say at the end about how much advocacy has gone into this movement. And it hasn't just been me, been a lot of people behind me and out there on their own doing this. And that's what today is kind of about. So this presentation is dedicated in memory of Dr. Nick Harris and Dr. Charles Ray Jones, great friends to the Lyme community and also good friends of mine. So about the association, the only thing I'd like to add is—
excuse me, you'll want to do screen share.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry. Yeah. it's down here. I found it. Okay, you can see it now, right?
Very good, thank you.
Okay, so I want to add that we also have a Lyme Aid for Kids program, and we've awarded a $419,000 to date for children whose families can't afford to get started with them on the process of diagnosis and treatment. And we started that with the impetus from Amy Tan, author Amy Tan, and also by the help of Dr. Charles Ray Jones, and I definitely needed to acknowledge that now at this point. So the early history of Lyme. The discovery of Lyme, there was actually a mom that did this. Polly Murray, mother of four. She's an artist and lived in Lyme, Connecticut. During the 60s and 70s, she, family, and neighborhood children had unexplained symptoms, rashes, joint pain, fever, and they were either unable to be diagnosed by mainstream medicine or diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. And this symptom cluster made no sense to her. She was even told that her symptoms were psychological. How familiar is that, everyone? In 1975, she alerted the Connecticut State Department of Health to 40 cases and had a meeting set up with Dr. Alan Steer, rheumatology, and that initiated official public health investigation, led to identifying a new disease. And in 77, it was identified as a separate disease. And in 82, it was identified as the causative agent of Borrelia burgdorferi after Dr. Willy Burgdorfer. Later, it was called Lyme, but I just want to mention that the first Alan Steer papers on it called it Lyme arthritis. Polly was a great advocate for decades, and she died in 2019. Now, to set the stage for my own story, I want to talk briefly about early Lyme in New Jersey, 1978 through 82. There were two important publications by Dr. 𝗍𝗶𝘀𝗶𝗿, who's up in that picture with me, was involved in, and they first said that there was a focus of Lyme disease in Monmouth County in 4 particular townships, and that one of those is mine, and they surrounded Earle Naval Weapons Station in New Jersey, and 49% of those who acquired their infection from those dates lived or worked in these 4 townships. The second publication was by Yale University individual and Dr. 𝗍𝗶𝘀𝗶𝗿, same year. A proportion of Lyme arthritis cases decreased in 1982 due to early antibiotic treatment and better reporting of milder cases. Proportion of cases with positive serology increased with severity of the clinical syndrome. And I'm bringing these to your attention because obviously this started out as being considered arthritis, and rheumatology got heavily involved and got a lot of the research monies. And early on, I think the publications and the attention were pretty good, very early on. And in 1997, actually, Earle was one of the first sites to test the 4-poster deer treatment station. And it's a secure facility surrounded by a 7-foot-high chain link fence, topped with 3 strands of barbed wire. And I guess they felt they could keep the deer in or not let them in, but the deer were in there, and unfortunately the ticks were out. So in 1984, I was a Board of Education member, and in my district, all of a sudden, staff, students, administrators became very sick with a relatively unknown disease. And I said to the superintendent, we have to get information out here for parents and staff members about this disease. And he said, well, what is it? I said, Lyme disease. He said, what's that? I said, I don't really know. And he said, well, if you can find information, we'll distribute it. I have to tell you, I searched everywhere for that information and finally found out from a friend who lived close by, whose son was first diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, then with Lyme, and she had gotten her information from Naval Weapons Station Earle, which again, a few miles from my house. I contacted them and they sent me a sheet with pretty extensive information that for that time, and had the bullseye rash and many other things. And we distributed that throughout the district. But the big story to me, no health officials ever came to the district or contacted the district, despite the high absence rates. And there were rumors all over that there was staff in the hospital with some disease that was in their brain. They were getting IVs for a very long time. So I decided I better learn all I could from any source. And it took me a while, but I found a state legislator who had Lyme, and she actually headed the New Jersey Insurance Committee in our legislature. So in the late 80s, my oldest daughter was in college, and she called me, and she had some really strange symptoms, and strange symptoms seemed to be what Lyme disease was about. So I sent her to the hospital there. And again, this was the late 80s. And I told her, I think you have Lyme, tell them that. And they looked at her, they diagnosed her, they treated her without any issue whatsoever. Meanwhile, my youngest daughter was having all kinds of symptoms, and they were kind of vague symptoms, and she was a traveling soccer player and so on, and she'd become lethargic, had to go to bed after games, all kinds of things. So I took her to the doctor. I asked him to test her for Lyme, and he wouldn't do it. He said, I'm going to give her all these other tests. I said, what are you giving her those for? He said, well, that's what I think I need to do. I don't think it's Lyme disease. So he said, he finally, after me arguing, said, if those are negative, I will test her for Lyme. Well, guess what? The other tests were negative. He tested her for Lyme disease, and he refused to call me with any results. And I had to threaten legal action to get the results. And guess what? She was positive. So my daughter was out of school for 4 full years and 2 partial years. And she was on home instructions when she was able. And she had for 3 years straight temporal lobe seizures continuously for about 18 hours every day, 6 out of every 7 days of the week. But she was tough. She graduated high school on time. She was accepted in a top college and graduated 𝗍𝗵𝗀𝗃 and with honors. So the late 80s and early 90s, I advocated for kids with Lyme in the schools. I was still on the Board of Education. I traveled throughout New Jersey to help kids. I attended their IEP meetings. I went to court twice for them. And in 1990-ish, one of the first doctors in the country to be charged by medical boards for treating Lyme was done. It was charged in New Jersey, and that was my daughter's doctor. So in 1992, I went to a town meeting hosted by my Congressman, Chris Smith. So I said to him, so what are you doing about Lyme disease? And he was kind of like, well, what? I don't really know much about it. So he asked me about it and continued to his credit, and he immediately agreed to help. And a few months after that meeting began what I consider my federal public involvement. He had hosted a meeting for me with the CDC, the NIH, and others in his office in DC. And I presented my 9 school district survey information on Lyme disease. I had 4 days to prepare it. I contacted these districts. I knew they were high in Lyme, and I put it all together in a report, and I presented it in his office. And when I was finished, I said, I want to tell you about my daughter. And I said, she's a gifted student. She plays an instrument. She plays traveling soccer. And I said, but I want to introduce you to her today. And I reached under the table and I pulled out like a big satchel, and I dumped it on the table. And in that were the boxes and the vials and the bottles of pills and all kinds of things that my daughter was taking. And I have to tell you, the federal officials were shocked. They picked them up. They asked me a lot of questions about them. And later my congressman said to me, boy, you sure know how to stop a meeting. But as a result of that, the CDC itself came to New Jersey to do its own school district study. And they used 5 of my 9 districts that I had presented. They never published it, which I was after them for a decade to publish. But however, Congressman Smith hosted a meeting in my town and told them they needed to come and present it, which they did. And my daughter and I spoke at that meeting, and there was a full house. And by the way, later on, not that long ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, the Lyme Times published that study. We had them publish it so it would get out there. So as a follow-up to that school district study, the CDC did something you may have heard about called the Rocephin study, the gallbladder study. Basically, they came into the New Jersey hospital with all these kids that had Lyme disease, and the long and short of it is they stopped basically the prescription of Rocephin, and they prevented a lot of Lyme treatment. And one of the doctors who was primarily treating most of the kids in the whole Northeast no longer could treat Lyme disease. So in 1997, I joined the Lyme Disease Association of New Jersey as president. It's now LDA. I was also chair of the New Jersey Governor's Lyme Disease Advisory Council and president of the Board of Education. It was a busy time in my life. Now, this is a map. The one top left shows the reported cases in 1990. And of course, the states that show up white had no reported cases. And you can look at the one to the right at the top, and that shows you the 2019 cases. And you'll see only one state, Oklahoma, did not have any reported cases. And then down bottom left, it's 1990 through 2019. And those show you the numbers of reported cases. And the box, of course, has all the numbers in it. But my bottom line point is looking at those numbers on from those times in 2022, this is now what CDC says. Recent estimates using other methods suggest that approximately 476,000 people may get Lyme disease each year in the United States. That, folks, is pretty significant. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about legislation in Congress. I'm not going to go over all these bills, so don't panic. It's 2 slides of bills, and the reason I'm showing them is you need to understand the advocacy that was going on over this time period to try to get something done about Lyme disease. And I worked with Congressman Smith from the time I went down there until today. I was just with some of his people on Saturday. And the bottom one on here is from 1993 to 94 Congress. It was the first bill. And he worked with another congressman to amend it and actually got money from the Department of Defense for Lyme. But that must have been some anomaly or nobody knew about it, because after that, it was very difficult to get anything through. And Congressman Smith is into autism and Alzheimer's and other healthcare issues. And he's gotten many bills through. And he said to me a couple of years ago, I just don't understand it. He said, we can get all these bills through for all these other diseases, but yet here we have Lyme disease, and look what we're doing to try to get these monies passed. Fortunately, we have been successful in the last several years in getting legislation passed. And right now in Congress, Congressman Smith introduced Children Inflicted by Lyme Disabilities Act of 2021. The LDA initiated and helped to write the bill. And actually, it'll amend the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act by including Lyme and other tick-borne diseases under other health impairments. And that, folks, will help our children in the schools, because oftentimes the schools still do not understand the problems of these students. Now, this is a slide showing federal legislators that the LDA worked with over the decades, because I think it's important for you to see where these people came from and that they worked hard. There's former US Senator Rick Santorum from Pennsylvania. We worked with him for many years. There's House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy from California. He's the former majority leader. I negotiated with his office for the working group bill. And there's Senator Charles Schumer, now the Senate Majority Leader. For many years, he has hosted press conferences in New York and invited me, and I've spoken in there. Former Senator Chris Dodd, he worked for many years in the Senate alongside Chris Smith in the House, bipartisan, to produce Lyme disease bills. Former Congressman Chris Gibson from New York, and I worked with him on the tick-borne disease working group bill. Senator Richard Blumenthal in Connecticut, he's also former Connecticut Attorney General, and I'll have more to say about him later. There's Congressman Chris Smith and Senator Susan Collins. She did the 𝗟𝗆𝗃𝗃 Tick Act, the Senate version, and Chris Smith had done the House version. Now, this is a listing of the House Bipartisan Lyme Caucus. These are House members who are interested in Lyme. Wouldn't you think that there'd be a lot more members of the caucus? Unfortunately, and we have had times every year where we've gotten people on board, but then other people leave Congress, etc. And it's really sad that we can't get more people, but these are very influential to getting our legislation passed. So what kind of investigations have been proposed or carried out by Congress? In 2001, the GAO had an investigation of Health and Human Services programs and resources and for Lyme disease. So they gave a report to the congressional requesters of this investigation, who are Senator Dodd and Senator Santorum, and from the House, Representative Good, Representative Pitts, and Representative Chris Smith. So the results were basically that they felt, the GAO felt, that this was consistent with their respective missions, and CDC and NIH conducted increasingly broad range of research, educational activities, etc. And the bottom line is, considering that was 2001, I certainly didn't agree with their conclusions then, and I think that what has come to pass with Lyme has shown that that really wasn't the case. In 2019, Congressman Smith introduced Amendment 355 to the National Defense Authorization Act for 2020. And the House, by the way, voted to pass this. I think it was unanimous. It directed the Inspector General of the Department of Defense to conduct a review of whether the DoD experimented with ticks and other insects regarding use as a biological weapon between the years of 1950 and 1975. Unfortunately, the Senate did not follow through and did not pass that amendment. Now in 2020, Congressman Smith introduced a very similar amendment, but used the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, to do this investigation, and it was the same parameters of the investigation. So how did this come about? If you look at Bitten in the lower right-hand corner with Chris Newby, I had gone to Congressman Smith's office in the mid-90s and told him I had a concern about things I was seeing and hearing about Lyme, and that maybe it needed to be looked into, but I really didn't have enough information. And he said to me, if you ever find enough information and facts for me, you get them to me and I'll try to get an investigation. When Chris Newby's book came out, I had some lengthy conversations with Chris, and I felt that this was ample material. She had a lot of material from government sources, printed material, and different other kinds of material. So I went to Chris Smith, and he actually on his own purchased the books and distributed them throughout Congress to influential people. And then that's when these amendments came about. Unfortunately, so far, we haven't gotten the Senate to agree to it. Now, what about congressional hearings? Well, this is an interesting story. 1 week before August 5th of 1993, there was a scheduled hearing by Chairman Ted Kennedy on Lyme disease in DC. So on the day of the hearing, many of us went down, including me, and on the spot, they actually postponed the hearing And there were more than 100 people there, I know that. And I think it was because they saw all those people, they got nervous, they never expected it. So they actually postponed the event. And so those of us who went down that day were put in a room where Senator Kennedy spoke and the staff wrote out our testimony. So on August 5th, the next week, when they held then this physical hearing that they were supposed to have held, Senator Kennedy opened and said that our written interviews from the prior week would be included in that day's hearing record, which they were. And in-person testimony that day included people you might know: 𝗍𝗶𝘀𝗲𝗄, Alan Steer, Evan White, Carl Brenner, Karen Vanderhoof-Forstner, and Matt Carter from Connecticut. I don't talk too much about this hearing because another advocate and I were sitting in Senator Kennedy's office after the event. We wanted to talk to his staffer that had worked on this event, and we overheard a telephone conversation, and not on purpose. We were just there, and he didn't know we were there. And basically, he was laughing with someone on the phone about the testimony of the patients at that panel. And I have to tell you, folks, I can't tell you how that made me feel. So anyway, in July of 2012, Congressman Smith hosted a hearing. He was the chair of the Health Committee of Foreign Affairs Committee, a health subcommittee. And so the presenters were Dr. Stephen Barthold, one of our researchers, Dr. Ray Stricker, many of you know, Dr. Mark 𝗟𝗆, myself, Evan White, and 𝗟𝗆𝗆𝗄 from the United Kingdom. Now, the important part of this, and it was all important, believe me, because it was the first formal hearing on the House side of this and international in scope. The testimony from this part of the testimony from Dr. Barthold, this was about the NIH grant process. Because of firmly entrenched opinions within the medical scientific community, evidence of persisting, viable, but non-cultivable spirochetes is slow to be accepted, and research proposals submitted to NIH that feature persistence following treatment are likely to receive prejudicial peer review in the contentious environment of Lyme disease. Negative comments by peer reviewers of grant applications in the current financially austere NIH climate result in unfavorable scores if they are scored at all. And what that did, that reinforced what many of the scientists and advocates had thought, is that the NIH review process when it came to Lyme disease really was not looking in an unbiased way at what our researchers were submitting. So I talk about appropriations language for a minute because it's very important to Lyme disease, and a lot of people don't understand it. There's two types of bills that are associated with spending. Authorization bills, they set up the programs, and appropriations, they provide the dollars. So each year, Congress has to pass appropriations bill to provide the money to carry out the programs. And each year, the LDA crafts appropriations language with the Smith's office, and he is the Lyme Caucus co-chair. And the language for consideration to be placed in committee reports and final reports. These reports come out with the bills, so they're very important. So he submits this language that his office and we agreed to caucus members to ask if they'll sign on to the letter for this language. And then they're sent to the Labor HHS appropriations and the Department of Defense appropriations. So we have had significant language that's been inserted to an appropriations report over the decades. So the bottom line is you can't just go and ask Congress for money. You have to get some restrictors in there, because that money will sometimes not go to Lyme. Maybe it's going to go to vector-borne disease, which does include Lyme, but many other vector-borne diseases. That dilutes the money that we get for what we need. So we try to incorporate that language that will steer the dollars we want to Lyme programs. And sometimes the legislation itself will actually get changed in some way along the way. And individuals, even in our own community, don't always realize they have to fight to keep those monies from being diverted. And we've had that happen to our Lyme monies. So we need to get as much specificity in language into regular bills and appropriations bills. So it's not all about money, folks, but about where and how the money is expended. Otherwise, money you think you end up with may not all be going to Lyme disease. So if you're considering doing anything with legislation, just a couple of quick tips. Don't ever develop it in a vacuum. Educate before you legislate. What does that mean? Educate your sponsor, educate your key players, educate your committee chairs, and make sure you have your facts in order. You can't go there without facts to present reliable and representing reliable, intelligent witnesses. And include a mix of patients in with the people that you're going to have be the experts, and coordinate your topics for the hearings. You don't get much time to talk, so you want to cover all the points. And the pitfalls, please remember this, that if you have legislation passed once, it's seldom rescinded. All legislation is not necessarily good. So if you get something passed that's bad, it may be there for eternity. And if you get lesser legislation passed, they may just be giving you lip service, and you may get no more legislation, or at least nothing significant. And here we all know Lyme is extremely controversial, but legislators don't even themselves always understand that how complex the Lyme politics and medical situation is, and that there's powerful opposition and vested interests, and influence often underestimated by policymakers and advocates. So please remember, our patients' lives and health are at stake. So be careful and understand the process. Remember one last important thing. Sometimes we have to kill these bills because they get bad through the process, because they're undermined, the language is commandeered. And it's up to us then. We have to stand up and say, no, we don't want this. This is a bad bill that's going to hurt patients. And a lot of times people don't understand, oh, we just need that. It doesn't matter about all that. Well, yes, it does. It matters entirely. You can't pass a bad bill for patients. It's there forever. So you've all heard a bit about Dearborn, Michigan in 1994. This has had a huge influence. It's probably one of the biggest negative milestones that we've had. So the history is Dr. Stier and Dressler in 1993 published a study which basically talked about which bands more often and which best distinguish Lyme disease from a control group. Well, right after that, Dr. Stier and company published Overdiagnosis of Lyme Disease in JAMA in 1993. And this was the result of 788 patients at his clinic. And here was the conclusion. Only a minority of patients referred to the clinic met diagnostic criteria for Lyme. The most common reason for lack of response to antibiotic therapy was misdiagnosis. Well, folks, as you can imagine, this was a bombshell, and it completely changed everything. Our family practitioners, pediatricians, IDSA docs, and many others from that point forward were using that overdiagnosis paper. It was a terrible turning point. So in 1998, Columbia's Dr. Brian Fallon came back with the underdiagnosis of neuropsychiatric Lyme disease in children and adults. And quote, failure to recognize Lyme disease early in its course can result in the development of a chronic illness that is only temporarily or partially responsive to antibiotic therapy. And the LDA provided funding for that study. So now we're up to Dearborn itself in 1994. Extensive sponsor list, including CDC, NIH, FDA, CSTE. So what happened there? Well, unfortunately, Dr. Stier's reports and others like it were accepted as the official surveillance criteria for Lyme disease by the CDC. And this Dearborn committee decided for surveillance or research purposes that they were going to exclude 31 and 34 bands of Lyme in the definition. So that meant now, if you had a positive or an equivocal on an ELISA, then you were able to get a Western blot, which in order to be positive, it required 2 out of 3 bands for the IgM and 5 out of 10 bands for the IgG. And guess what? No 31 and 34 bands were included. But these standards at that time were not meant to serve as a basis for diagnosis. They were meant to be used for surveillance. And participants like Dr. Nick Harris, our dear friend, now gone, from IGeneX, expressed concerns and fears there that general practitioners would not understand the distinction. And there were no minority reports at Dearborn. So after Dearborn, the discussion has centered around since that time about the band removal, diagnosis, and if the removal was due to the vaccine. So in the 2018 working group, I wrote a minority response for the 2018 report to Congress. So the working group had recommended evaluations of new technology to diagnose Lyme, but they didn't address the immediate problems under two-tier system. Getting new technology is years in the making. So the minority report I developed gives the Dearborn ban removal story. And in there, I asked that labs be required to report all excluded bands in the current Western blot. And I have to tell you, I had brought that up. I think it was my first meeting on the first working group. And I brought up the fact that we should restore the 31 and the 34 bands. And all I will say about that is there were some government people that didn't particularly like me for that statement. I think they were I thought they were more upset than they should have been. And anyway, that's another whole story. So the Lyme vaccine, and this is before and after Dearborn, and 𝗟𝘃𝗏, that's SmithKline-Beecham. So in 1994, 𝗟𝑆KB met with the CDC and the FDA. Now this was months before Dearborn that we just talked about. And they met to go over requirements for a case definition of Lyme disease. I don't know how many people even knew about this meeting. So in 1998, this is what came out. There was another meeting, and 𝗟𝑆KB had indicated that the issues on clinical design, including case definition and the CDC case definition for clinical trials, was discussed at this meeting. And this is what 𝗟𝑆KB said at this meeting, quote, "The case definition was essentially that was agreed to by the advisory committee meeting in June 1994 and finalized by agreement with the FDA." So what does this mean? Folks, this means that while the Dearborn criteria were only being voted on in October of 1994, 𝗟𝑆KB had already met and were in agreement with the FDA and the CDC, they had embraced that very same standard that was then later adopted at Dearborn for use in Lyme vaccine trials. So it does appear that perhaps there was some relationship. So in 1998, there was the FDA hearing for approval of LymeX. When the votes were tallied, the vaccine was approved, but with great reservations. In fact, the chair said, "It is fairly rare for a vaccine to be voted on with so much ambivalence by everyone with a stack of provisos." So they did approve it, but let's look 6 months before the approval. Dr. Alan Steer and other researchers published results of a test tube study, basically, that showed that 𝗚spA, that's the outer surface protein of the Lyme bacteria, could cause a cross reaction with a protein in humans that were positive for a certain gene. And this could be 20 to 30% of the population that would have this. Now, this 𝗟𝗄𝗃 that they were talking about was the base of this very vaccine. So that meant the immune system could attack the body's own protein, thinking it was an invading bacterium. So there was no proof at this time that it could happen in humans, but there certainly was a possible connection. Now, based on this and other things, in 1999, the law firm of Scheller, Ludwig, and Beatty in Philly filed a class action suit against 𝗟𝗃𝗏. It represented all those getting that LymeX vaccine. And the purpose was to put people on notice about the dangers of vaccine and get medical monitoring for any future vaccine use. Now, Dr. Ronald Schell, the University of Wisconsin, was quoted back in that time as saying, "I wouldn't take the vaccine. I recognize that's a prejudice based on my animal research." His published study found that hamsters vaccinated with 𝗟𝗄𝗃 following Borrelia burgdorferi infection developed arthritis. Now, I spoke with him in 2020 up at the LDA conference. He ran to the elevator and I ran behind him and got in. I think he thought maybe he was going to be attacked, but I just wanted a scientific discussion for a couple of minutes. So anyway, the bottom line is it was very concerning. And I was traveling around the country and giving presentations, and all people wanted to talk about was the vaccine and how they had heard about these adverse events or either experienced them or someone they knew. So we were so concerned that I went down to Bethesda in January of 2001 and testified before the FDA's Vaccine and Biological Products Advisory Committee hearing on the vaccine. And there were many individuals there some who claimed to be harmed by the vaccine who testified. And I'm not going to get in my testimony, there's a little blurb there. But the FDA panel concluded at the end that the benefits of the Lyme vaccine outweighed the risks and didn't change product or labeling indications, but they did require 𝗟𝗃𝗏 to provide more vaccine safety and efficacy data. Now, so what happened? What did we do? So we were still very concerned because we kept hearing all these patient and physician concerns by now. Physicians were stopping giving the vaccine because they heard so many. So we tried to meet with the FDA privately. They spent a lot of time trying to not have us meet, to the point where they told me that if we had a meeting, they couldn't bring anybody who was not a consultant to the LDA, and told me that was a law. Well, folks, fortunately, I'm pretty good at researching. It was not a law, but it still took the intervention of Congressman Smith, who wrote to them, and I never forgot what he said. "What is it that Pat Smith wants to tell you that you don't want to hear?" And after that, they scheduled the meeting, and we brought in a team of experts, including someone who was integral to the development of the 𝗟𝗃𝗏-based vaccine. And on his opening slide, he said he served as a volunteer consultant to the Lyme Disease Association. So the bottom line is, can't get into the meeting. There's a lot of information on our website about it. But about a month after the meeting, the FDA faxed me late a Friday night answers to questions that I had prepared for and submitted to the meeting we'd already been to, because they told me I had to submit them and they'd answer them there, and they didn't. But I'm not going to tell you what those answers were because it would just get me aggravated. Anyway, a few days later, 𝗟𝗏𝗏𝗀 announced the withdrawal of the vaccine from the market, citing poor sales. And subsequent to that, the Lyme Disease Association was permitted by the Pennsylvania court to submit a letter in April 2002 in support of the proposed Lyme vaccine settlement. So what's happening with the vaccine now? Well, the 𝗍𝗏𝗏𝗀 through the French biotech company has already gone through phases 1 and 2. They are going into, or already are in phase 3. And the bottom line is, not only did they use the same base of the vaccine, the 𝗟𝗏𝗄 that was used by LymeX, but instead of one 𝗟𝗏𝗄, they used 6 different types of 𝗟𝗏𝗄, because they said they wanted to cover all the different 𝗟𝗏𝗄s from US and Europe. So they've received a fast tracking from the FDA. What does that mean? That means they can skip certain parts of the process. So the 2022 phase 2 trial already shows there's a value in adding a 3rd dose of the vaccine, and that there's also a trial for pediatrics aged 5 to 17 that's ongoing. Now, supposedly they have modified 𝗟𝗏𝗄 to prevent what happened last time, but yet they say that on one hand, but on the other hand, they say they really didn't know that there was any problem with the last vaccine. They've not reached out to Lyme organizations for Q&A, at least not to our knowledge. So what about treatment guidelines? I'm not going to say a lot about that, but here's the bottom line. The bottom line is that this is a table that I fought to get into the 2020 working group report. Believe me, there was significant opposition for it. And what this table does, it compares the IDSA guidelines and the ILADS guidelines, showing the difference. And the difference is, of course, is in how much patients can be helped by having the guidelines that indicate that they are more patient-based guidelines. And on that note, I go to the Attorney General of Connecticut, and we, and along with now LDO and now GLA, approached Attorney General Blumenthal and educated and worked with his office about Lyme patients and problems with the IDSA treatment guidelines. So at this time, doctors across the US were treating based on clinical judgment, treating long-term, were brought up on charges. And there were 2 guidelines with 2 different viewpoints. Only one was being allowed to be used, despite unsettled science on the issue. So in 2006, the AG proceeded with the first antitrust investigation against the medical society's guidelines development process. And in 2008, he announced the settlement, and he said he uncovered undisclosed financial interests held by several of the most powerful IDSA panelists, and the panel ignored or minimized consideration of alternative medical opinion and evidence regarding chronic Lyme disease. So in 2010, IDSA agreed with Blumenthal to reassess their guidelines. They installed an independent arbiter. It was reassessed, and their panel voted lockstep, except for one dissenting vote, to uphold all of the original recommendations. So what about the HHS Working Group? Well, you probably don't know, but there was a working group in Washington for years before the one we got created by legislation in 2016. But it was only the agencies making all the decisions for patients, and none of it was being done in public. So we worked with Congressman Gibson and Smith to get something under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. The agency certainly didn't want it to happen. The Advocate Coalition worked hard to get the language we needed into the bill, the Gibson version, and language into the 21st Century Cures. I did the final negotiations on the bill, and the government balked at the last minute. They would not give us diversity of viewpoint. And I told them, I'm very sorry. I said, our advocates and patients will never accept this legislation. We'll just have to oppose it. And I hung up the phone. 2 minutes or so later, they called me back and they said, you have the diversity of viewpoints. We got it in and we got it passed. So patients now have the opportunity to sit at the table with the government in public and have intelligent discussion. What should happen to the main stakeholders, our patients, and also, quite frankly, to our treating physicians. So what happens with a report to Congress every 2 years? These reports contain recommendations. So in the 2018, one of them contained a recommendation that the NIH should develop a strategic plan for tick-borne diseases. Well, folks, wouldn't you have thought that the NIH would have had one? Well, guess what? We found out during our process, they did not. But to their credit, in 2019, based upon that, they developed an NIH strategic plan for tick-borne disease research, and they allowed for public input. The LDA did put their input into that. The 2020 report to Congress, one of the recommendations we had was that federal government websites and educational materials, seminars, etc., provide information about the state of the science associated with Lyme is limited, emerging, and unsettled, and that there's diverging viewpoints. Well, that was in 2020. In 2022, just recently, as a matter of fact, on the CDC's treatment of Lyme webpage, they have some patients report persistent symptoms of pain, fatigue, or difficulty thinking, even after treatment for Lyme. The state of the science relating to persistent symptoms associated with Lyme is limited, emerging, and unsettled. It's a first step for Lyme disease. It's a step in the right direction. A lot more needs to happen. And this, one of the other recommendations for CDC was that they develop a curriculum for physicians. And then also there was language about making sure who participated and so on. So in 2021, they did develop a curriculum. It's now on something they have called CDC Train. There's 4 modules and a webinar. And I guess my mom used to say what I have to say tonight, and that is, if you have nothing really good to say, you shouldn't say it at all. So I guess I shouldn't say it. And I will move on to LymeX. HHS and the Cohen Foundation have a public-private partnership, and it's the largest one in the world. And their mission is to accelerate Lyme progress, especially talking about the development of next generation diagnostics. And so I have been involved in some aspects of this program over this time. And I am happy to announce, and it just happened this evening, that May 22nd, today, they're announcing their competition to accelerate the development of Lyme diagnostics. And phase 1, I think it will be $1 million. And they're going to recommend up to 10 winners. They have contests. And what happens is that researchers compete, they submit, and then they compete for these grants. And the goal, of course, is to get something done and be able to submit it to the FDA for review. And we hope test to detect active infection. So in 2021, for some unknown reason, that LymeX funding was not included in the congressional appropriations language. It was in there apparently early on, and at the last minute, I understand it was pulled. Don't have any reason, know any reason why that happened. But the partnership is still operational, but there's so far for 2021, at least, there was no new funding that, to my knowledge, from the government that was provided. I think this is a good program, folks, and could really move the field along. So legal actions. Dr. Jones went to the Supreme Court in 2013. I can't get into detail, but most of you know he was brought up on charges by the state medical board. He made it to the sorry about that. He made it to the Supreme Court, and he did lose. However, only 3 to 7% of cases actually go to the Connecticut Supreme Court. So that meant there was some merit in the argument that was used, and it focused attention to the issue. Also in the IDSA lawsuit of 2017, and you know about the 23 patients and estates filed civil action under RICO, antitrust, and all 8 insurers settled by 2020. The Tory plaintiffs agreed to drop all charges against 6 guidelines authors in 21, and unfortunately, the federal judge dismissed the lawsuit against the IDSA in 21, and the IDSA asked the court to impose sanctions against the patients, and they declined. But this is a very important case. The insurers settled, and there's more scrutiny on guidelines. And in 2007, I was invited as an advocate to the CDC in Colorado to present what we were doing. And I spent the day there. They were very open. I was very open. And they did a lot more outreach after this time with the Lyme community. And we had another meeting with a lot of advocates there in 2013. And I must say, the next one, 2007, very important. We endowed, along with Time for Lyme at the time, our partner, the Columbia Lyme Disease Research Center. Very important milestone, very important thing that happened, a major institution. Real quickly, challenges today. The testing is still a huge challenge. Treatments, prevention, surveillance, we need a lot more of it, especially Midwest, South, and the West, because they still don't think there's Lyme disease in the Midwest. Doctor education, changing attitudes of medicine, insurers, legislators, and get answers from the government. Who's really behind this decades of denial? I don't know yet. So what can we do? You can volunteer. I provided the history of who, what, and how of getting it done, or at least a lot of it. It shows the political morass and the medical morass, and we need help from everybody, everywhere. So please evaluate your strengths and your likes and consider how you want to proceed. Do you want to help the Pennsylvania Lyme resources? That's wonderful. Do you want to work on your own? That's wonderful. Do you want to start an organization? That's okay too, but you have to start small, whatever you do, because too many people I've seen take on too much and fold in a short period of time. And in closing, this is just a list of publications. We have many more, but I wanted to point out we have a conflicts of interest in Lyme disease laboratory testing, vaccination, and treatment guidelines. Download for free from our website. It was written by a science writer that you will know, and it tells you a lot of these things about what happened with the way this has all developed over time. And I thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Beth. That was wonderful. At this time, if anyone has questions, you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom, or you can leave a comment in Facebook, and Pat will take your questions this time. Eric will take some questions as well.
Yeah, for those that are interested, I mean, just you heard Pat Smith and you heard just the resource and the depth of the knowledge, you know, as your journey with Lyme and as you've been going through either yourself or your family, you know, it's pretty evident that there's a wall that's been built and it's going to be very, very difficult to break it down. And I loved what Pat said in terms of volunteer. I mean, grassroots is grassroots. Being able to participate, being able to lend your support, however small, however great that is, you know, everybody on this call and just about everyone that we circle with are volunteers. And it's all because either we were hurt or our children were hurt, and we want to make a stand that we don't want this to happen to anybody else. And so I think with May being Lyme Awareness Month, the fact that this scope of presentation of kind of what brought us to the table to be where we're at, it's so valuable for everyone to understand. It's complicated. There's a lot of moving parts. It's difficult to really get to the source of it. I know my experience in working with individuals is it's intimidating. It is intimidating to know, how do I even get started? What is it that I can do? For PA Lyme Resource Network, we have approximately 18 support group regions All of them are run by an individual that is a volunteer that was affected by Lyme, or their children were, and they said, we have to make a stand. So between medical conferences, patient conferences, legislative advocacy, there's so much that can be done. And it really does start in your neighborhood, working in your community, in your school, in your neighborhood, in terms of trying to get information out there. So as you're watching this or listening, if it raises any questions, please ask. If it raises any comments, let us know what those are. It'll be very, very helpful to kind of move the dialogue forward. So Bill, I'll kick it over to you if there are any.
Not a question, but a shout out to Pat Smith. You're amazing, and thank you for your blood, sweat, and tears. You make a real difference. Which I echo that.
Yeah, we second that.
Yeah.
I'm getting some text as you were talking, Pat. I've been getting some text messages from individuals that are in our group. One of the questions was kind of, when you look at the original IDSA guidelines in 06, and then the actions by Senator Blumenthal, at that time Connecticut Attorney General, and I guess there was enough ammunition for them to reassess, to reevaluate, and in 2010, when they came back and almost doubled down and stood by it, within your ability to comment in a public venue like this, what would you share with us as to maybe motivation, or perhaps where they were coming from? Was there any underpinnings that maybe we're not aware of? Because that comes up, maybe not frequently, but it does come up, where if people are just reading the cliff notes, they'll say, well, they did a reassessment and they're standing by it. What would you want us to know as advocate as to maybe what some of the underpinnings of that might be?
Well, I mean, the only thing I can really say to that is that, a lot of people did not like what the assessment came back as, and they felt that there was some things that still went on that maybe shouldn't have gone on, but it would have required probably another whole level of examination. And at that time, there was not really someone who would, was going to pursue, whatever that next level of examination might be. And as to if the question is, speaking to the IDSA and their motivations, I can't, I can't really address that per se. I can only say that, they have stuck by, quite frankly, as far as I can see from when I've started, they've stuck by everything pretty much. They haven't, I don't think they've moved off the dime, quite frankly. A few of the things agencies have done, maybe they've moved off the dime here or there, which I'm very happy about. I don't see that the IDSA has moved off the dime, and maybe I'm wrong. That's just my opinion.
Okay, we have a couple of questions. One is for us. Will the presentation be available on your website or YouTube for those who are not able to watch it live? Yes, it will be on our website, palyme.org. It will also be on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. So yes, for those that are on Facebook, it will be available in the video section of our Facebook page as well. Now a question for Pat. It's about the diagnosis codes, the ICD codes. The question is, do you think that those new diagnostic codes is a big step forward in people accepting chronic Lyme disease?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I know that there were some advocates that were involved in trying to get those various codes in there. But since it really just came to pass, I think it's really hard to make a determination. You know, sometimes things appear like they're going to help, and then something happens down the road and they don't necessarily help, or it's a neutral thing, or, you know, whatever. So I think it's just too early to make that assessment. Certainly it was good that the concerns and so on were brought to that body about you know, what was happening with Lyme. But again, I think it's just too early.
Okay, Pat, we got more shout outs to you. Someone says, "You're my hero." You've given us the gifts to keep on giving. Really appreciate your talking about advocacy. And then we have another one. Great presentation, Pat Smith. Thank you for all your hard work through the many years. Okay.
Well, I just can I just thank the patients, because having lived this vicariously, I can tell you they are the heroes, because I don't know how many of them have pulled through over the decades, and I've known them, and I've known people that have died from the disease and whose children have died from the disease. And, you know, I consider them to be what has held this together. And I started with 3 children, 2 of whom had Lyme. One is still many, many decades later has it, and now is also COVID long hauler. And but now I have 4 grandchildren, and I'm here to ensure that they and all the children, that we protect them, and because they're not being protected now. I can tell you that. There just is not enough out there to protect them from these terrible 17, 18, 20, whatever tick-borne diseases now. There are new ones being discovered all the time, just in the US alone.
Not to ask you a too personal a question, Pat, this is my question. How are your kids doing? Are they still suffering from Lyme? Are they doing pretty well? What is in general, what's their state?
Well, of course, they're long adults now, but my youngest, it was a complete nightmare most of her early life, especially the 3 years of temporal lobe seizures. I don't know how familiar people are with them, but she was able to, with a lot of help, of course, and thank God for our good Lyme docs, and she was able to pull out of it. Still had problems with it, did a lot of alternatives in addition to other things for decades, has done. And unfortunately, when she got diagnosed with COVID 2 years ago, she also again had 5 tick-borne diseases at the same time. And so it's a never-ending battle. And a lot of our patients, I do want to say, have gotten COVID and are having problems, you know, related to that. So that's something else on top of it. We can only hope that the research that's being done for COVID, because the long hauler symptoms and the long-term Lyme symptoms are a lot of times, you know, somewhat the same. And so there's a lot of research into those areas, and I think that'll hopefully help our patients. And my other daughter, I think because hers was diagnosed sooner, and she was treated immediately at the hospital, you know, before everything got turned off, all the treatments and so on. And I think that helped her. She still had problems, but they were not as severe.
Okay, I will.
Here's a question that I got, Pat.
Yeah.
The Tick-Borne Disease Working Group, federal, 2018 and then 2020. We're now in 22. What is the status of 2022's group, the committee, and kind of insight to where that's going?
Okay, well, I have to tell you, when I saw the first meeting of this year, it was very, very concerning to me, because the things that were happening were the same exact things that go back for decades and that go back to the beginning of the first two working groups, the arguments from the same players over, chronic Lyme and over what should be put in the reports. And it was hard for me to sit on the other side of the computer and watch what happened. And I'm concerned about it. I'm not going to say I'm not. There are some good people on that working group, and they certainly and hopefully will. And I guess that the second meeting that they just had, which I was not able to watch, unfortunately, but I heard that it was a bit better. And I hope that the government, players, are coming around, because now with the amount of cases that are being seen, and also with the spread of the other tick-borne diseases, reality has to set in somewhere along the line, that someone has to take the first step and say enough is enough. We've had 47 years of a disease, and you people can't even get a test for our patients that determines if they have it or if they have active infection. I just find that utterly amazing to me, utterly amazing. And I guess it's why people say, why are you still here? Well, that's why I'm still here, folks, is because I just can't understand it. And I would like to get to the bottom of it. And I'm doing my darndest to try to do that.
As you were saying that, I was getting a text from someone that says, it's not just amazing, it's criminal, it's unconscionable. And it is, no two ways about it.
Could not argue with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could not argue. And I think the biggest thing that's always disturbed me, if there's a bigger thing than anything else, it's illogical. Look, I wasn't a scientist, I was a mother, for heaven's sake, and I was thrust into this. And as a mother, I'm looking at all this, and I'm looking at my school district. I mean, these people were decimated in there. Where were these health officials? Obviously, by the information I presented today, they knew all about it. Why weren't they there? Why didn't they do something? When I presented them with the data down in DC in 93, they were like flabbergasted. This couldn't be happening. Oh, this must be just some people. I presented how much people were spending, even at that time, $100,000 a year. This was going back in 1993 to get help. And I said, no, this is not unusual. These 10 people I selected, I know them all. I said, I didn't even go out there to the people that I didn't know. And why? I don't understand. It's so illogical. Everything is in place. The research is in place, the patients that are suffering, the physicians with the great knowledge, the scientists who are, they're doing such great work now, looking at, what's really causing, infection. And do I believe personally it's persistent infection? Yes, I do. Do I think every case is necessarily that? No, I think a good percent is. And I think the work at Hopkins and, other kinds of places on the, looking at that issue as to what these persister cells are. It's wonderful research. Why hasn't the government touted that? Why don't they put that up and say, look, this is what's happening? They never even want to look at it, even when we were on the working group. There was a lot of information. They didn't even want us to put certain things in the reports. But I have to say, it came around, and the first group was pretty. The first working group was pretty cooperative. By the second, well, I think Lyme patients got too much out of the first, and I don't know, just my opinion. It was a lot tougher for me, at least, and I was really the only patient advocate then, and it was a tough time. But we got things. It wasn't a loss. It's never a loss. We have that information in writing, and the advocates and the patients should know. Look at these reports to Congress. You can pull things out of there that are now good, solid pieces of evidence to use when you go to your legislators or whoever to talk about this. So please use those reports. They carry a lot of weight.
Somebody would like to know, do the working groups discuss getting insurance to pay for tick-borne illness treatments? This person has been suffering with Lyme and co-infections for 40+ years.
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of that question.
It was about getting insurance coverage. Does the working groups talk about getting insurance coverage for treatments, basically?
Well, I think that, well, what happened last year, that was supposed to be something that was included in our report, but unfortunately, due to circumstances beyond some of our control, it didn't necessarily make it in there. This year, I think they may be taking a look at some of those issues. And I have to say that outside of the working group, that many of us have gone and lobbied and spoken with insurance companies. In fact, I came to Pennsylvania with a group of advocates going back probably, I don't know, 10 years ago. And the experience, unfortunately, with insurers, we sat there, we had great experts, and Lorraine Johnson was there, and we had other people there, doctors, and we presented to these insurers and the insurance committee or legislative insurance committee in Harrisburg. And we gave them all this great information. And about 2 months later, suddenly someone sent me the letter that the insurer, an insurer who sat right there that day on that panel, sent this letter out and told your legislature in Pennsylvania that he opposed totally that this bill that would cover Lyme disease, and he went down all these things. And I'm thinking, we spent hours in there with all kinds of, and this was all provable facts about how much money they could save if they changed their whole philosophy, which is to treat early and treat as much as the patient needs based on the doctor's clinical judgment. Then perhaps we wouldn't have 20, 30% or more of our patients developing chronic disease, and you wouldn't have them. But I don't know, you know, they want instant money all the time. That's what it seems to me.
Here's a question. Do you collaborate with the Center for Lyme Action?
Do I collaborate? Well, we often are in communication, or at least at times are in communication, yes. And I've been on phone calls with them. But we have been doing certain work that we have been doing, and we continue to do that work because it's been effective. And we feel like we have a system set up, and that's what we do. However, we certainly don't do anything that's against the work that they do per se, because they do some good work, and they've certainly gotten some things passed and helped in getting things passed. And but we go in and we do a lot with appropriations language, you know, as well as other issues, and we cooperate when it's necessary to get things passed.
Okay, Eric, do you want to wrap us up?
I will wrap us up. Pat, I just want to touch on one thing that you said, that it's illogical that how the insurance lobby addresses it in terms of covering for treatment, that it's just illogical with all of the evidence. And it's kind of the bane of our existence that, you know, we've always been taught growing up that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We've always been taught that throw pennies at it today to save dollars tomorrow. And it seems like that common thread would follow in our argument. And that's kind of the wall that we keep hitting. And when I say we, you know, PA Lyme Resource Network, in our wanting to support legislation that would have insurance reimbursement. If your private doctor believes in following a guideline that's recognized by Act 83 in Pennsylvania, using an ILADS guidelines, that persistence of symptoms and persistence, that having long-term treatment, long-term antibiotic, that is the viable path for a doctor to take with the patient, that there are still insurance companies that are not going to step up to their financial obligation. And when we look at that, and we use the same argument that you used 10 years ago, that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, we can't understand how to crack that. You know, where do you start? Where does it even happen? So I don't as much know that I'm asking for an answer or response, but you know, we share the same concern that we're still working. And of course, now it's with all new individuals, new legislators, new senators, new members of the health insurance lobby, new members of the medical society. So it's almost like we're starting over, and that might be their mode of operation, just to wear you down, and through attrition, they wear you down. But I will say, something that you have sparked this evening and what you've done for 25 years has definitely lit a fire under a vocal community of people that are communicating with me by text, that, you know, we want to kind of lend our efforts to some of the things that you have started. So maybe offline and maybe in the near future, we will circle back with you. We want to thank you very much. We think it was very, very beneficial what you've done, and you're spending time with us this evening really hopefully will kind of cast a die that we can put into place going forward. So with that, we want to thank you very much. I want to remind everybody, I'll very quickly go to a share screen, and what we want to do for the next month is we are going to have Senator Michelle Brooks be part of our June Virtual Lyme Impact Session. We're actually very, very pleased. We are also, May 19th, which is Tuesday, we are going to be out in Clearfield County with Senator Langerholt doing a Lyme tick awareness town hall meeting. So there is starting to become activity and movement within the legislation here in Pennsylvania. So be on the lookout for the invite for next June 21st, a month from now, where we'll listen to Senator Brooks talk a little bit about the legislation that she is introducing. So we would ask that you participate. We would ask that you spread the news and get it out there. This is grassroots. None of us are paid to do this. We need everybody's involvement, everybody's support, and ultimately, we will be getting out to each of the support groups in Pennsylvania to be working through our membership to be contacting your representative in the House, your legislator, your senator in the Senate, so that we can start putting a little bit of heat and try to get some movement across with this legislation. So with that, I did not adequately introduce William Moore. He is, of course, our board member. He is our IT director. He helps with the facilitation for all of our virtual Lyme sessions. And with that, I want to call it an evening. Bill, thank you. Pat Smith, thank you very much. And we'll see you again. So thank you, everybody. Bye-bye now.
Thank you, Pat. Good night.
Thank you.